Bojo, Misko Benishi, Indigenous Cause, Wabashishi, and Dodam, Bokajnan Gai, Kumni Jack, and Nojaba. Ojibwe, Padawan, Miodawa, Skinny Quaindao, Gai, Medeo, Skinny Quaindao, Miigwech. Nui Jagana Shujana. Hello, my name is Misko Benishi, which is Redbird in Anishinaabe, and that's my spirit name. I come from the Martin clan, and originally my parents are from Baker Lake, Nunavut, and Walpole Island First Nation. So I am an Inuk and Ojibwe on my mom and dad's side.
We went bojon in the way Maganadok, no gem indigenous cause, Gaye, Mainga, and Dodem, Lane Lenape, Quay, and Dow, Lenape, King, and Donjaba, Nickababy de Quay. Good afternoon. I'm Carol Hopkins, and I'm the CEO of Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, which Marshall has already said to you, but I come from the land of the Lenape people in southwestern Ontario. My father's family line comes from the Munsee Delaware First Nation along the Thames River, and my mother's family line, and also where I live, is the Delaware Nation at Moravian Town, which was named after the Moravian missionaries that followed us and settled with us there in southwestern Ontario. Happy to be here this afternoon.
Mm-hmm. So we can get started.
Yeah. Oh, I want to say, just while we're switching to the slides, is that it's important for us to introduce ourselves by our spirit name, our nation, and our clan, because it honors our ancestors. You might not understand what we're saying, but it's important to our identity that we sound that Indigenous language. It's important that that sound is in creation again. It too contributes to climate change and facilitating balance in the world again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you much for that great reminder. So like Marshall said, we're taking this lens and shifting into a strength-based paradigm. So Marshall talked about truth. Did anybody see the movie Indian Horse? So what do you remember most? Just think in your mind what you remember most about.
So it's not on there.
Oh.
I'll switch.
Yeah, you can do it.
There we go.
Yeah. What do you guys remember most? Just think about that movie. What do you remember? And also, while you're remembering this movie, take some time and pull out, maybe if you want to jot down some notes, because we're here today to plant some seeds and to give you guys some tools, maybe towards working towards reconciliation. And I really like this analogy. My auntie just brought it up about planting seeds. And when you think of a garden, you plant the seeds, and then you have a little seedling, and then you watch it grow. And then from that plant, you also have seeds. And then with those seeds, you can plant other seeds. So I really like that analogy. So have you ever known anybody who's lived on the streets? Or in Chicago, it's also known as Skid Row. When you think about those people who live on the streets, do you think that they have empathy or sympathy towards each other? Or as you see them living on the streets without a home or without many things, do you remember feeling sorry for them? Or did you ever feel like you should do something more? How about, has anybody ever worked in a soup kitchen? Even just working there or volunteered a little bit of your time?
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that truth side of the conversation. And this is my own personal story related to colonization. You know, I have 9 grandchildren, and most of them are young adults now. They were all excited about this Indian Horse movie. And the title, Indian Horse, of course I want to go see it. Have no idea what it's about. Until I get into the theater and I'm watching the movie, and I'm having flashbacks of different points in my life. And things are falling together like a puzzle. And I'm reflecting on, oh my gosh, this is my uncle's story. My uncle, with all of his siblings, was in the first residential school in Canada, often referred to as the Mush Hole. And he went to Chicago to play hockey for the Chicago Blackhawks. He skated with Stan Mikita. But he lived and he died on the streets of Chicago. And then there's a part in the movie where the little boy is locked up into this black, dark cage. And I remembered my father. As a little girl, we would, our family would come back to Canada, at least a couple times a year to visit my grandparents. And my father, I could hear him talking with his siblings and my grandparents, but they were arguing because they had been drinking all evening. And so their voices were loud, they sounded angry, he's crying, and I'm trying to make out what's happening, being hyper-vigilant and in the space. I'm not sure, whether we're going to be safe or not. And so when I was listening to him and I figured out what he was talking about being locked up in the dark for the weekend. And not knowing about residential schools, I assumed that his comments and his anger and his anguish, along with the tears, was directed at my grandmother and my aunts. The thinking is grandmother and aunts, they look after the younger ones, and it's their responsibility. So they must have done this to him. And I was really confused and conflicted because I loved my grandmother, and I was thinking, how could she do this to my father? Until I saw this movie. And I realized that wasn't my grandmother at all. And as a child, there was no place to talk about this. There was no one that I could ask the question of. Was Dad talking about Grandma? Did she do that to him? I couldn't ask that question. And then I remembered my father and my uncles, they came to Chicago to work. And that's where we were born and raised, my siblings and I, until my father passed away. My mother took us back home to Canada. It's where I live now. But two of my uncles, the one that was going to play for the Chicago Blackhawks, as I said, he lived and died on the streets, along with another uncle. And they would come and visit us every so often. We lived around the Lakeview area, if anybody in the house knows Chicago, not too far from downtown. And they would come and they would drink. But they would always show up with some fresh fruit and vegetables or a bag of peanuts. My favorite. I loved peanuts. They called me Peanuts after a while because I grabbed onto that bag of peanuts. And our parents would take us down to Skid Row, and we would drive around in our station wagon, no SUVs at that time, and look for them. And we would stop. My father would park on the street. We would get out of the vehicle and then go visit my uncles wherever they were at, in an alley, on a sidewalk, against a building, sitting on the curb. Didn't matter. And my parents taught us to respect them because they were our uncles. And when I saw this movie, I was thinking back about those experiences that I didn't understand as a kid, about my uncles living on the streets and not understanding that as a kid. But the buffer of my parents' teachings that we will respect them because they're our uncles, they're your uncles, and they're important enough that we go visit them. And when I think back on that now, I'm a social worker, by the way, I don't ever remember my mother and father trying to change them. They just accepted that was their choice in living, and that we had a relationship that was critically important to maintain, and we went and visited them no matter where they were at. I don't have any memories of them smelling. I don't have any memories of them with fear, that I had to be afraid. I don't have any memories of being a child wishing, can we get out of here already? Like, let's go to the playground, let's go to the lake. I don't have those memories. I only have the memories of the jokes they told, the stories they told, and the way that they expressed their caring for my brothers and I. We went down there often. They came to our home often. But they didn't stay. And when I think about that now, there were other family members that came from Canada to crash on the couch while they did some work in the city for a period of time and then went back home. But my two uncles that lived on the streets, they never stayed. And so that, when I think about that now, it says to me that our family and our parents were teaching us something. And then my mother, 5 children, would get on the city bus, go down to Skid Row, and we would all work in the soup kitchen. So she was busy doing her thing, and as children, we were, getting out the clean cups or putting the dirty cups away and cleaning off the tables and visiting with the people that were there to get food. Again, without any thoughts of fear or nervousness or judgment. They were just people, and we were there to help them. And so the value of acceptance and that we are living in service to others, if we have something to give, then we should give it, were core values that I took away from those experiences. But, by the time the Indian Horse movie was over, I'm just crying. And I looked around when the lights came on, and I could see there were other Indigenous people in the audience. And we all gathered down, at the front. How are you? Are you okay? Do you have somebody to talk to? Did you know about this before? Is this the first time you're seeing this? Is this the first time you're understanding this? And so we were checking in with each other after watching this Hollywood movie. It was a movie, but it was depicting real life. And for the first time, I understood that my uncle's story about hockey was not just his story. It was for many First Nations people that went to residential schools. And I've got the clicker. So what Misko said our objective is to plant some seeds. We're serious. Take out some paper. When we asked you, did you see the Indian Horse movie? What do you remember? When you see people on the streets, what do you remember? What's your first thought? Why does all of this matter? We're talking about reconciliation and shifting to a strength-based paradigm. This seems kind of contrary to that. But why does this matter? Just a word or two, write it down for yourself. I want you to reflect on it. And as you reflect over time and discuss this with other people that you're with throughout the days, you can add your comment or reflection in Huva. I don't know how, but somebody else does. Somebody will teach us how to do that. But why does this matter? Why does the story of colonization matter? So, like I was saying in response to the great presentation by Gary Belkin, that we can't just focus on the truth. We also have to focus on possibilities that facilitate hope. And the story of decolonization is in this second half of the story. Misko and I both belong to a ceremonial lodge known as Medewin. And for the Anishinaabe people, that's the way of the heart. It holds our evidence and our knowledge for life, everything. It's our health, it's our social structure, it's our university, it's our primary education system. It has all of the knowledge we need for life. But through colonization, that went underground, and many people became disconnected. So way of the heart means we think from our spirit first. And in the 60s and the 70s, there were Native Americans in the United States that got together and started to challenge the lack of housing, the lack of employment, those determinants of health we were talking about earlier. And they formed a coalition that is called the American Indian Movement. And the American Indian Movement was about equity. It was about challenging the system that was racist and oppressive. It still is. So Eddie Benton Benet, his name is Badwewadam Benesiaban. He died during the pandemic. Great loss. But he was a spiritual advisor to the American Indian Movement. And I didn't know anything about the American Indian Movement. I knew that they set up a teepee next to Wrigley Field in Chicago, and I would walk by there and, what are those Indians doing over there? We called ourselves Indians then. I don't call myself an Indian now. But I would wonder, what are they doing? What is that teepee about, and why are they gathered there? And I was able to ask that question. Why are they over there? And someone said, oh, that's AIM. But the community of First Nations people that I associated with in the city of Chicago didn't always include Indigenous people. And we would go to the American Indian Center, and that's where I found out what AIM was and what they were about and what they were trying to do. And they held walks in the city. So that was my first introduction to creating change. I didn't know what difference it would make, but they were walking across the city of Chicago. And they were all First Nations people, and I wanted to be part of that. So I walked. The American Indian Movement also made its way into Canada and Winnipeg, where there's lots of gang activity. And so the American Indian Movement there was addressing the gang mentality by helping young people to get reconnected to their identity and to our own worldview. Affecting change within relationships. If we focus on that relationship with our own spirit first, then anything is possible. And so our teacher, Badwewadam Benesiaban, he also talked about our relationship with land and with water. Water most significantly because water is the very spirit of life. And so he would, in the 70s, talk about if we do not take care of our mother, the earth, if we don't take care of water, and he was at a conference in Walpole Island, where Misko's father's family line comes from, and he was talking to a confederacy of nations, First Nations, and they had the pitchers with the glasses of water on the table, and he said to them, if we don't do something to correct our relationship with creation, there's going to be a time where you're not drinking from glasses out of a pitcher of water. You're going to be drinking from a plastic bottle of water. Now, in that time, bottled water was not anywhere common. That was in the 70s. And he said that if we don't do something about this, not only are we going to be drinking out of plastic bottles of water, but that plastic bottle of water will cost more than an ounce of gold. Now, I don't know if water costs more than an ounce of gold anywhere in the world, but it's a message that he was teaching people in the 70s that if we don't take care of creation and our relationship with creation, it will be out of reach. Something as basic as our right to water will be out of reach. In Canada, we still have many First Nations that live with a boil water advisory for eons. They've been living with boil water advisory. They can't turn on their tap and drink the water. They can't bathe in it because it will create infections in the skin. And so there was a grandmother that heard that when he was retelling that story. Now we're into 2005, maybe? And so she went back home to her family. She lived around Lake Superior, and she said, "This is what our chief is telling us. What are we going to do about it?" And she said, "We're going to pray for the water. We're going to walk all around every one of the Great Lakes, and as we're walking, we're going to pray for the water." And so that's what she did. And my mother went with her. There were very few people that joined her when she started that walk. Lake Superior one year, Lake Michigan the next year, and on they went. They went to as far as walking across Turtle Island by walking from the four directions back to the center around Lake Superior, praying for the water. And that picture in the bottom is my two grandsons walking next to the water, teaching the next generation, planting those seeds and nurturing them. You have a responsibility to care and love the water because all of creation cares for us as human beings. And according to our teachings, there are older relatives. And so why or what does this have to do with mental health and mental wellness? What does that have to do with mental health and mental wellness? And again, ask you just to reflect on what you might be thinking or what you might be feeling right now. So this is a couple of those little boys that were walking next to the water before, or just as they were babies. The far picture is my grandson when he touched the earth for the first time. And around him are all of his cousins and family. He was in a big hurry to come into this world, and so he came into this world quite early. And him and his mom were in the hospital forever, and we were doing ceremony and praying for his safe arrival. He came into the world and he arrived. And so we wanted to tether his spirit to the earth to make sure that his spirit knew that he was welcome and he belonged. And that mirrors our story of creation about how first human being came into the world, or first red color of man came into being on the earth. And then I'm showing these other pictures because how those babies are dressed in their tickanoggins or their moss bags reflect their identity. And the lacing up of the tickanoggin or the moss bag is not simply a way of keeping them intact. It represents our DNA. And there's an understanding that our DNA is both spiritual as well as physical. We are people of the land. And we have to maintain our relationship and connection to the land if we are going to be healthy and well in life. And so when you think about mental health programs and services, helping people with their life, dealing with their trauma, how often are we talking about their connection to the land? How often are we talking about how we facilitate the expression of the DNA that is their identity?
So now I'm going to go into what reconciliation is and kind of what that looks like for me. This quote is from Justice Murray Sinclair, my grandfather. But he said that reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining mutual respect, relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country, Canada. In order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. So the path of reconciliation kind of follows some key steps, and those are, the first one is you have to be willing to establish a relationship. So establish a relationship first with yourself and then with those around you, whether they be non-Indigenous or Indigenous peoples. The second thing is do you own learning, and you have to create awareness. You do not put the burden on others to educate you. You have to go out there and maybe you come to different talks, or you read different books, or you read things on the internet, or you listen to podcasts. You don't give that burden to somebody who is an Indigenous person to tell you all of these things. You have to go out and do that yourself. The third thing is to acknowledge the harms. So you don't have to explain it or offer your thoughts, just know and acknowledge it. It can be shocking for Indigenous people to talk about these things. It's okay to have feelings. Just acknowledge them. You don't have to express them all the time. Just acknowledge them and know that they're there. The fourth thing, like I said, is atonement. This is challenging but necessary. So think about small ways that you can atone different things. Obviously, nobody in this room helped with residential schools or was involved in those processes, but I'm pretty sure everybody knows what they were. You still have to acknowledge the past. And then the last thing is action. So you have to do action and go about it in a meaningful way, and whatever action that means for you and what you think that means for other people. Oh yeah, I have the clicker. So the first thing is awareness through education. So that picture on the left side, that's a picture of my family. And my family has always been there for me. They always encourage me to continue with school, to continue my education. I'm currently an undergraduate student studying criminology. So I want to become a lawyer one day, and I want to advocate for those people that don't have a voice or whose voices aren't heard. That's what I kind of want to do. So my family has always been a big part of my life, not only for that, but they always support me. The next two pictures are from a meeting with the Indigenous Student Association. So at my university, I'm the president of the Indigenous Student Association, and the Indigenous Student Association is there for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to create a voice. We host different educational events, and we just want it to be known that we are there on campus and we deserve a voice and we deserve a seat at the table. While I was in high school, I went to a Catholic school and I was the only Indigenous person. It was very hard to, one, go to a Catholic school being the only Indigenous person, and being the only Indigenous person, everybody was like, oh, like, what do we do for this? Like, you're Indigenous, like, give me all the answers. No, that's not how it works. Not all Indigenous people are the same. That's another way I had to always educate and be like, well, like, can we take a step back? Can we reflect? Maybe ask another person, ask another Indigenous person. I'm not gonna give you all the answers. Yes, I'm Ojibwe, yes, I'm an Inuk, but I can't tell you what a Haudenosaunee person thinks, or I can't tell you what the Lenape people's teachings are, because that's not originally where I come from. So to educate yourself in realizing that not all Indigenous people are the same as well. The next thing is acknowledgement. So acknowledgement, often there is pushback. For myself, I'm an Indigenous youth. Being a youth, first of all, I get a lot of flack. Being like, well, you're only 20, like, do you actually know what you're talking about? Or, you know, you're not even finished your undergrad, like, are you sure, like, that's what the Constitution says? No, like, yes, I am young, yes, I'm an Indigenous person, but I still know what I know. And that people should respect me just Just because I'm a youth, people shouldn't disrespect me. So when you talk to an Indigenous person or when you talk to an Indigenous youth, don't disregard their thoughts, disregard their feelings, and acknowledge what they're saying. There's an assumption that colonization is not just something of the past. That's something that's still here today, so we need to acknowledge that. In this quote, it's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. And I think we just need to acknowledge everybody's truths. Like my Auntie Carol said, we come from the same lodge. And one thing that Badwewood and Banaisiaban always talked about is respect. Respect, respect, respect. And I think respect is very important when you acknowledge people. They're kind of reciprocal. If you have respect for somebody, you also acknowledge their feelings. You also are acknowledging their thoughts. Another question for you guys. So do you understand how colonization is experienced by youth? Think back maybe to when you were younger, when you were a teenager, when you were a youth. Do you think that you knew what colonization was? Did you ever feel that within the school or communities? Or as you're learning more about the history in Turtle Island, did you ever reflect and kind of take a step back and be like, what would it be from an Indigenous person's side? The next is atonement. So atonement, for me, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to be like, oh, you guys need to make a list and you need to do this. No, atonement is not my responsibility. It's your responsibility too. You need to come up with different things, and you are also responsible for your actions. I can provide you information, I can tell you my thoughts, but ultimately your actions is for you. You are responsible for your own growth. We're just giving you the seeds for that. Each person has a responsibility to figure out what they can do and what they want to do.
So, another reflection question for you. What emotions have you noticed in yourself as we've been talking? I thought this presentation was going to focus on strengths, and I'm not sure where the strengths are. Maybe that's what you're thinking. How do you feel about that? Or, I've never heard reconciliation talked about from that perspective. What do you feel about that? Pay attention to what you're thinking and what you're feeling. Just take a minute. Write that down or record it in your memory. How do you feel about awareness, acknowledgement? How do you feel about Misko telling you, everyone has responsibility for taking action in their own atonement? Well, emotions drive people. Emotions are what create change. They fuel our passion and our desire. Emotions fuel our motivation. It's the fuel that helps us to launch towards change. Now, this is a conference around mental health leadership. We have to demonstrate our leadership around our own emotions and our own thoughts so that we can drive change, so that we can make change. Everyone in this room is a leader in change. We're change makers. We're facilitators of change. But frameworks and systems and models, they don't create change. They facilitate it. They provide a roadmap or a guide, but on their own, they don't create change. We make change. You make change. Together we make change. People make change. And we've made a huge impact on our environment around us. But we can also make huge impact on the environment around us. We have the ability and the capability to facilitate change in the environment around us. But we have to do it together. And we have to pay attention to how we feel about that. So reconciliation and mental health and wellness, it's critical. It's critical. It's critical to the survival of people, our relatives in creation. When Gary was talking, I was sharing at the table over there, I looked up, how does climate change affect birds? Because in our story of origin, birds are critically important. They're the ones that carried the seeds. They carry all the songs. And different birds have critically important work in terms of our wellness. And so when I looked that up, what I saw was the red on the map around the Great Lakes. And that's my home territory. The hummingbird and the robin are affected by climate change around the Great Lakes. So the robin teaches us about sunrise. There's a whole beautiful teaching about the importance of sunrise. So if the robin disappears and his song or her song disappears, that's going to affect the balance of life. Now, again, we have teachings about how the Earth's axis has changed in climate change, how that's affected our mental wellness as people. The hummingbird carries all the songs. That's our language. As human beings, we're all given a sacred sound. And the hummingbird represents that sacred sound, carries all of the songs, all of the teachings, can go backwards and forwards, go into the past of our ancestors and bring it into the present. That knowledge is critically important for how we think about reconciliation. Reconciliation is about reconnecting those relationships. And if our services don't reflect that worldview, if the way we facilitate mental wellness does not reflect that worldview, if our services and our theories do not reflect our very spirit, then we're going to create change, but it won't be enough change. And so we have options. Great Spirit gave us this beautiful gift known as free will. That means we can decide. We have choice. And so we're talking about inclusion. Inclusion means challenging epistemic racism. Racism that judges evidence, worldviews, that says, I don't understand what you guys think, so it must not be credible. I was at a conference in Canada, and a speaker stood up, speaking on behalf of government, and said all of these great things, and I thought, oh, this guy gets it. He's talking about the importance of our culture. But his conclusion was, but there's no evidence that any of that stuff works, so we can't fund it. I wanted to get my big hook and pull him off the table. Sit down with me. I have a conversation to have with you. That's epistemic racism. You don't understand it, so you discredit it. It's not real evidence. It doesn't count. Folklore. You call it your creation story. I understand stories as, things we make up. It's knowledge, it's evidence. Our worldview has an evidence base, and that's our story of origin. It's our story of creation. And mental wellness means getting reconnected to that story of origin. In Canada, we've developed the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. And it says culture has to be the foundation, has to be the starting place. We are no longer at a stage in our relationship with each other where culture is an add-on. If you feel like it, if you have the right person that believes it, if it's convenient, if you have enough time, if you have the right person, it's no longer an if. Culture has to be the foundation. And so it's complex. It's not easy to figure out. You've heard, we're not all the same. We have our own language, we have our own sound, we have our own relationship with the land that we come from. Our wellness is informed by that. And it's multifaceted. It's not just one aspect of our physical being and our whole being, it's all of our being. It's our mind, body, spirit, and emotions, and our relationships with each other as people, our relationship with the land and the water, our relationship with the universe around us. It's relationship-based. And it has to be continuous. There will be little tolerance for going backwards. Cat's out of the bag. We have a way of understanding the world that is critical to our wellness. And we're not going backwards. We're not going to give it up. It's not going to be an old idea. It's not just a fad. It's real. And it's important. And so, part of that in Canada and reconciliation, we have lots of conversations now that begin with a land acknowledgement. I want to honor the people of this land. And that sound is getting louder, and that statement is getting more consistent and continuous. And it's a statement. But eventually, the more we continue that, the more we plant seeds, the more people will believe, the better the relationships will be. Because it's a sound that says, I honor that there are the original people of this land. It doesn't have to be political about who owns. It's about our relationship with each other and with the land. And our treaties are all about relationships. And the treaties were signed based on an understanding of spirit first. Not about economy, not about the commodification of water. It was about sharing water. That was our worldview. That's all we knew when we were signing those treaties, was our worldview. But it got interpreted as something very different. And so First Nations people will talk about their rights and their title. And their rights and their title is about their identity. Have a right to my identity. It doesn't matter how it gets denied under the Indian Act of Canada, BIA in the United States. We still are Indigenous people because the Creator gave us that identity, and nobody can take that away. And the more we sound that out, the more comfortable it gets, the more easy it gets to be Indigenous, to look differently, to dress differently, to wear our identity on the outside and not hide it internally because of fear and shame. So, question for you again. What windows have you opened to decolonization? What windows, what openings have you created to facilitate decolonization? because this is an everybody job. Reconciliation is a responsibility of everyone. If we want to facilitate inclusion, if we want to make a difference in climate change, then how we understand relationships and how we participate in relationships has to identify the truth about what we think and what we feel. And if we can't be honest with ourselves, reconciliation is just drawn out that much longer. So, what have you done to open up even your own thinking and feeling about decolonization? What have you done as a leader in mental health to create that opening to decolonization? Again, seeds of thought. So, hint, reconciliation is, it's about reclaiming our identity and feeling that pride in who we are, using our own language. That's a sacred language. In our indigenous languages, we do not have the number of words that we have in English to describe illness and sickness and pain and suffering. Because our language came from the Creator. It's a strength-based language. It's all about, our story of creation begins with the Creator thought of the most beautiful place where life would grow. That's the beginning of that story. And everything that unfolds from there is with that thought. How do I facilitate? How do I create the most beautiful place where life can grow? And that's reconciliation. We're trying to facilitate a place where life can grow in balance. And so that worldview and all of the possibilities are held within our language. In Canada, we now have a Language Act that includes Indigenous languages. Now we just have to figure out a way to put that into practice, because it's not yet. There's no policy around it. There's no funding substantial enough to ensure the survival of the Indigenous languages of the people of Canada. Our culture and our nationhood, that all matters. And that way of thinking can facilitate wellness for all humanity, not just Indigenous people. Being connected to who you are, knowing where you come from. What are the teachings of your people? What are their strengths? What are their cultural practices that facilitate wellness? And then building relationships with that in mind. And having those conversations about, this is who I am and this is how I think. I mean, back when my uncles were living on the streets in Chicago, there wasn't anybody talking about culture and inviting people to speak about culture and reconciliation at that time. There was the American Indian movement that was pushing. They were pushing equality. They were pushing against racism and facilitating a conversation that got people reconnected to their culture as a way of displacing the harms that they experienced. So reconciliation has been a discussion we've been having in the AAMHL for quite a while. We had a conversation in Vancouver. I don't know what year that was. 2015. We hosted a match on reconciliation and mental health. And this is one of the quotes that came out of that discussion. One of the positions that came out of that discussion. Reconciliation is about shifting to a strength-based paradigm. Strength is our culture. Strength is our language. And so when we think about mental health and mental wellness for Indigenous people, oftentimes the conversation starts with the disproportionate numbers of people in the justice system who are incarcerated, or the disproportionate number of children in the care of child welfare, or the disproportionate number of Indigenous people with chronic health issues like diabetes, or the disproportionate number of people, Indigenous people who do not graduate from high school, and on and on and on go the numbers that talk about deficits. And pretty soon, that's all we think about. And then if Indigenous people bring it up, people get overwhelmed. It's like, oh my God, that's way too big. I can't deal with it. I don't know what to do. And shy away from the conversation because that's too much. Can't deal with it. Going to be too much money. That's not possible. But just like was said earlier, we have the answers, and they're articulated in the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework that says culture has to be the foundation. That's this. I'm going to figure out how to load it in Huva. Noah. And we have our own ways and our own systems. Like we were talking about, we come from the same lodge, the same sacred society. And so we have to change our way of thinking, that evidence doesn't come just through an academic system. We have our own evidence in our sacred societies. In 1970, when Eddie Benton was talking about plastic bottles of water, he was talking about a prophecy that we have fulfilled as human beings. And that our sources of knowledge, they come from sacred instruments, not just textbooks. Sacred instruments like this book called the Mishomis book. When Native Studies programs started in Canada, within the university systems, people said we didn't have any textbooks to talk about Native studies. We could talk about legislation and how that has affected us, but where was our own knowledge? And they found the Mishomis book written by Eddie Benton Benet in 1988. So that's our talk, and we're on time, thank goodness. But just in the 3 minutes we have left, I'm going to ask you, anyone, if you have one overall thought about the whole presentation. But I do encourage you to continue thinking about those questions we asked and to reflect on them.
Ja, Adrian Yellowhead, the Shittiness, Anna and Shani, Kanaka, the Shlet, Kabana, the Shishin, Nahitin, the Shishin, Godzilla, the Shinale, Okotelo, the Shlet. First and foremost, Ahihat and Sabo, thank you for coming and sharing today. I have a lot of grace.
Thank you. I have a lot of grace for you and a lot of respect for you for coming out onto this stage right now and talking about this. As a youth myself, I spent tirelessly my entire 4 years in high school learning about ways to help my community, and I'm involved with Unity, the United National Indian Tribal Youth Organization. And after graduating high school, it's been my lifelong goal to learn how to continue to exist in exist outside of predominantly Indigenous spaces, because I grew up in my Indigenous community, and transitioning to higher education has been hard for me because it's a lot harder to establish those relations with those in your community and learning how to exist alongside other non-Native people. And so I want to say thank you for coming out here and talking about reconciliation and what that means and how we can all learn how to be good relatives. I think that's really what the message that I got from both of you. So, yeah.
Let's.
My name is Samuel Parker. I'm a psychiatrist. I want to thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I was wondering, with respect to the issue in South Africa, some people said reconciliation means you no longer have any power over me. I'd like to hear your response.
I'm not sure I understood everything you said.
Can I repeat myself?
Yes.
With South Africa, the
Okay.
reconciliation, somebody said part of reconciliation is that you no longer have any power over me.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Reconciliation means you don't have any power over me anymore, is an understanding that I don't give you power as well. So it's always the relationship, both sides of it. And for Indigenous people, we're not sometimes even aware of how we have internalized oppression. And so when Misko was talking about, that acknowledgement, it doesn't mean you have to explain it. Just acknowledge can cause a shock, which is an awakening of, oh, how do I feel about that? Can help us as Indigenous people to examine our trust and mistrust. And when we're talking about power, that we understand power in terms of oppression and racism, but power is not inherent within our worldview. And that's the problem. We have learned power-based relationships through colonization. They're not part of our worldview and our values. We don't own the land, we don't have power over the land. We don't own people, we don't have power over the people. That's a foreign concept that then has become part of our thinking. And when you don't have much, you work extra hard to get more. And the more is the power. And then use the power against your own people. So it starts with us. We have to say to ourselves, we have everything we need. I don't have to rely on the power that you assume you have. I don't have to seek that out because it can be destructive. And do I want to be destructive? Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. And so power relationships come from dominization, paternalistic, colonized ways of thinking. They're not ours. And so if we are fighting based on power, we're going to fight over who has more power. Our goal is to get more power. I don't want that power. Your power doesn't mean anything to me. What matters to me is my identity and the power that I gain from my relationship with the land, with my family, with my community.
First and foremost, I want to thank you both for this very thought-provoking session. I think what's come out of this for all of us, and especially for me, was just the profound unpacking of reconciliation. We don't have enough discussion about it, but the way that you have opened up the doors as a together movement has really kind of opened that. I have to say, one of the things that touched me tremendously was talking about how sometimes we get caught up in evidence-based stuff. And we start looking at evidence-based from the standpoint of scientific data, when in actuality, the real data is right in front of us. So thank you for pulling that and increasing our awareness of that. And prayerfully, we can start working together as a group to enforce that particular portion. So thank you both again. And let's just give them another hand, please. It was just great.